My name is Lauren Hudak. I'm a senior at CM High School, and the name of my big board is The Real Price of U.S. Intervention in the Middle East. So I'd like to start my presentation with some numbers, and I realize these might be kind of hard to comprehend and a little bit long, but please bear with me as they have real meaning to the meaning of my presentation. 654,965 Iraqis have lost their life as a result of the Iraq War. 21,000 civilians are estimated to have died as a result of the war in Afghanistan. 20,000 to 50,000 civilians have been slaughtered in Pakistan. In terms of U.S. casualties, over 6,000 American soldiers have lost their lives in the Middle East, and a million have been wounded, in addition to the 2,753 American civilians killed in the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001. This, of course, is not counting the multitude of American civilian casualties that have occurred as a result of Islamic terrorist attacks, such as the U.S. Embassy bombings of 1993 and 1998, the Boston Marathon bombing of 2013, and the World Trade Center bombing of 1993. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the nature of the conflict between these two regions and why it's unique as we're comparing it to conflict between other regions. So taking any war into mind, obviously there are going to be some social tensions between the two countries as a result of the war. This is true looking at any two countries, really. I mean, if you take World War II, you can look at the tensions that existed between America and Japan afterwards, or France and Germany, and the like. And these tensions also exist between the U.S. and the Middle East, as I will prove later in my presentation. However, what is unique about these tensions is that instead of just being a result of the war, and they will go away with time, these tensions have actually worked in the past decade to help fuel the war between these two countries. Which brings me to my thesis, that the widespread conflicts that exist between the U.S. and some parts of the Middle East have transitioned from being rooted in political necessity to being fueled by ideological differences and social distrust as a result of past political action. So when the U.S. began its wide-scale intervention in the Middle East, it was mostly to settle conflicts and disputes between formal governments or for strategic political gain. And to prove this, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history between the two regions in the latter half of the 20th century prior to 9/11. I don't have a lot of time, and there's 50 years worth of political strategy to talk about. And so I'm just going to mention three key events that I believe set a huge amount of precedence and really described foreign policy from the U.S. in the Middle East at the time. I'm going to start with the UN recognizing the State of Israel officially in 1947. Now, I'll definitely talk more about the Israeli-Palestine conflict later in my presentation. I'll give a good explanation for it. However, it's really important to recognize that this was one of America's first huge political moves in the region, is recognizing the State of Israel, as we allied ourselves with them in their fight against Palestine and subsequently against the Arab world. And anybody that knows anything about wars, I'm sorry, I will scratch that, don't say that. It's probably very clear why this would put us in a bad light with the rest of the Arab world, considering that at the time Israel was one of their greatest enemies, and it still is today. The other two events I'm going to talk about both happened under President Dwight Eisenhower. I'm going to first talk about the Iranian coup d'etat of 1953, in which President Mohammad Mossadegh decided to nationalize Iranian's oil production. At the time, it had been being controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was owned by the British, and they took over 90% of the profits from Iranian oil production. So President Mohammad Mossadegh began campaigning to nationalize the oil production, and Britain called upon the U.S. for help. So the U.S. helped Britain stage a coup in the country, and this helped remove their president from power and instill a new leadership, one that did not plan on nationalizing the oil company. So at the time, the U.S. definitely complied with British needs and helped them as they were sympathetic to European oil interests. However, since it has become clear that the U.S. acted then, as with most conflicts in the 50s, under the threat of spreading communism in the Middle East. And might I just highlight that the U.S. was just beginning to recognize the amount of sway that the Middle East had, because it had almost a fifth of the world's population contained within it. And so they did not want communism to be spread, as with most countries. So they were very, very wary of nationalism in the Third World, especially Eisenhower's administration. So to quell nationalism, they installed their own government or they installed a coup which had sympathetic interests to their government in Iran at the time. This set a very, very important precedent for Eisenhower's administration and for the U.S. Foreign policy as a whole, which was that the U.S. was willing to disrupt the political order of a foreign country in order to further its own agenda, an example of strategic political action at its finest. I also want to talk about the Suez Canal crisis of 1956, and this is very similar to the Iranian coup d'etat. So what happened here was Egyptian President Nasser, who he was looking to nationalize the Suez Canal Company, and this was then duly owned by Britain and France, and it was a huge economic advantage. It was a key political trade route. It ran through Egypt, and the Egyptian president saw that it would be a huge economic advantage to their country. However, in this case, America was not called upon to act. Instead, America saw a growing threat when they realized that Russia would then come to Egypt's aid, and so they came to Egypt's aid instead. They wanted to keep any relationship between Russia and any country in the Middle East at an all-time minimum. So the U.S. basically told British and France and Israel, who also had a cut of the oil company, or of the Suez Canal, to back down, basically. And they announced what is now called the Eisenhower Doctrine. And this doctrine is very, very important for political strategy in the U.S. at the time. And it says that under the Eisenhower Doctrine, a country could request American economic assistance and or aid from U.S. military forces if it was being threatened by armed aggression from another state. So this doctrine was very important because it set yet another precedent for U.S. foreign policy. At this point in time, it was now officially America's job to police the Middle East. We would go in and settle disputes between formal governments. And this was very, very unique to American foreign policy because it gave us a sway in the Middle East that we hadn't had before. We were essentially a governing faction in the region at the time. And while this might have had political advantage for the U.S. because it was during our fight to become one of the world's greatest superpowers, and our amount of sway that we had in any country at the time was very, very important to our success. However, as with most countries that the U.S. intervenes in, we did not garner friendship after our intervention. Instead, after this long period of political intervention between the 50s and 2001, certain extremist elements in the Arab world began to organize against American interests, both ideologically and politically. So there was deep distrust between our nations, mostly between the Arab, this poll will indicate the amount of distrust that occurred between the Arab world against America. So I have a poll here by the Pew Global Research Group, and it shows U.S. favorability by country. And we have countries from all 6 continents, because it would be weird if Antarctica was on there, but we have research from 6 continents, and probably about 25 different countries that give favorability ratings of the U.S. Most of them are well in their 60s and 70s, definitely over the 50% line. However, the main countries in the Middle East, which might include Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Pakistan, Palestine, they all gave America extremely low favorability ratings, all below 50%, except, of course, for Israel, which gave America a favorability rating of 83%, due to America being one of its greatest allies. So this is all in these statistics generally stretch back from 1999 to 2014. However, the ones I'm referencing are ones taken in 2014, and they prove that there was social distrust between our two regions of the world. The Arabs, or many Arab citizens, did not carry America in a very favorable light. And there are obviously many reasons, as there are between any two countries, because as you can see from this poll, while the Arab countries gave America the worst favorability ratings in general, there were many varied reactions, such as in Argentina, where we got 36%, probably as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs. However, it's very important to realize that between every two countries, or all regions that have conflict, there's also going to be social tensions. You can't really blame all of the conflict on one armed aggression or on one war or on anything. So I reference this in my paper at detail. There are many people that have speculated as to the reasons for all the social distrust between these two nations, and many of them cite propaganda by the leaders of the country, blaming, such as maybe the U.S. blaming, or the impoverished third world countries of the Arab world, such as Syria and the like, blaming the U.S. for some of their political problems. Things like that are very, very possible. However, I'm going to kind of narrow down the distrust to come from what I have done my research, and I have learned that most people cite either the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, which I'm not going to talk about just from time constraints, but I'm going to really keep it limited to the Iraq War and the Israeli-Palestine conflict. So, looking at a poll of the Iraq War, I have many different parts of it here that people have voted on, such as how the war has been negative with respect to their personal safety and security, economic development and employment, and such of the others. But 72% of Iraqi respondents said that the war has been negative with respect to their personal safety and security, which is a huge number, especially since that was not the goal of the war. The goal of the war was not to degrade the personal safety and security of the average Iraqi citizen. And yet, it somehow seems that this happened. So, and again, I'm just going to go back to my paper and disclaim that this very well could not be this could be as a result of propaganda. This could be as a result of many things, or it could just be the actual fact that the Iraq War did nothing to benefit the average Iraqi citizen. It's up to you to decide. Anyway, also the Israeli-Palestine conflict, which I promised to explain later. And I'm sure most of you know exactly what this is, but I'm going to give a quick, brief explanation. And it's basically that Palestine and other members of the Arab world believe that Israel is illegally occupying the territory that they currently reside on. However, Israel does not, or they believe that they either have a right to this territory or that it's not worth fighting for, that they should just broker a peace agreement. And many peace agreements have been brokered. Many of them have been denied between the two countries. And so Palestine currently occupies the Gaza Strip and other small land reservations in Israel, in what is now called Israel, officially by the UN. And so when America became Israel's greatest ally, the Arab League basically completely misaligned itself with American values, as we were now supporting one of their biggest opponents. It's still a source of very much conflict today that Israel exists safely in the Middle East. I mean, safe for want of a better word, considering they're a continued armed assault between them and Palestine. So thus, members of the Arab world have made it very clear: any country that publicly supports and funds Israel and its fight to stay alive has declared itself anti-Islamic. And so in this period after pre-9/11, and kind of near the latter half of the 20th century, it can be said that there were definitely members of the Arab world that had organized interests against American interests. And so these can kind of be summarized with a series of terrorist attacks that occurred between the 80s and 2000. And so there's a lot of reasons why it could just have been an attack on American ideology, but it seems to be the case that with most of these, there is a result, especially since they are mostly bombing embassies in foreign territories, it's possible that these have occurred as a result of U.S. intervention and the dissatisfaction that many Arab world members feel with American intervention in their country. So some of the main terrorist attacks I have here are in April of 1983 with the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon, World Trade Center bombing on February 26, 1993, Kenya and Nairobi dual simultaneous U.S. Embassy bombings that occurred in 1997, and the 2000 attack on the USS Cole in Yemen. So many Islamic fundamentalist groups can be traced back to these bombings and attacks. However, leading up to the turn of the century, so late 90s, many of the terrorist uprisings that could be seen in the Arab world against the U.S. or on U.S. foreign soil were able to be linked back to Osama bin Laden and his terrorist organization Al-Qaeda. So with each of these attacks, Al-Qaeda became more influential in the Middle East until they gained enough resources to commit what was inarguably the most heinous terrorist act that has ever occurred on American soil: the bombing on September 11th, 2001. So my entire presentation, I've kind of been leading up to 2001. I've been talking more about the conflicts that have occurred prior to 9/11, American political strategy in the Middle East prior to 9/11, and then small terrorist uprisings and terrorist attacks as a result of that U.S. intervention. And it all kind of leads up to 9/11 being the turning point for U.S. Middle East relations. See, as my thesis states, prior to 9/11, political action in the Middle East it ended there. Political action. It was political strategic action. Very few armed conflicts. Not as costly and bloody and horrible as we know it to be today. However, after 9/11, 9/11 marked the turning point for U.S. Middle East relations. Before U.S. intervention was to settle political disputes, After we entered the War on Terror, it became an ideological war, in addition to it being for political strategy, for oil interests, for many other things, but it also became to be an ideological war, which many believe it was not before. It was mostly strictly politically necessary. So in studying the relationship between these two countries, it's certainly interesting. We've already looked at social tensions that existed in the Arab world against Americans, and it's interesting to look at how Americans view Arabs. So I have a visual here, not on here because I have to download it, but so it shows the American favorability ratings for Arab countries. And as with the Arab favorability ratings, it's very reflective of them. We give above average or around middle of the line ratings to most countries. However, with the Arab nations, it's well below the line of 50%, so it's definitely negative favorability. And the poll is set up in such a way that you can see how we feel towards Arabs and Muslims, which mostly the numbers coincide with each other. They are not negative, they're not largely different between Arabs and Muslims. But you can also see the difference in viewpoints of Romney voters and of Obama voters towards these cultural groups. So you have Romney voters, which are supposedly, even though there will be some variance, obviously, but basically Republican voters and Democrat voters. You have an actual it's a very much an anomaly, the way that they view Middle Eastern countries versus how they view other countries. And it's that way because in most other countries, say in Europe and Africa and South America and Canada, they have less than a 5% variance in most cases between the Republican and the Democrat opinion. However, when viewing Arab countries and Arab nations, the bipartisan divide in opinion is significant. In some places as much as 30 or 40%. With the Democrat voters getting closer to the 50% line, while the Romney voters or the Republican voters get closer to the 0% line. And so it's very interesting to see this because then it pretty much tells you this huge bipartisan divide in opinion that there has to be some political basis in people's views of Arabs. I mean, the social distrust that exists then must have some political basis. So that's very, very important to understand that it's not just a general, oh, I don't like Arabs because they're Arabs. No, there's a political backing for this. There's a reason why Democrats give them higher votings and Republicans give them lower votings, and it's as a result of the political action that's occurred between the two countries. The results also, this poll also serve as probable evidence to support the claim that the 2001 terrorist attacks had a profound effect on Americans, while not shock them into supporting Bush's war on terror. And the war on terror marked an obvious change in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. They turned out to be extremely long, costly, and bloody. They involved a lot of American lives, which was new to the equation, except in the case of terrorist attacks. And the U.S. was now forced to defend itself in ways it never had before. The whole nature of the conflict had changed, and it had become a very, very bloody and costly conflict between the two regions. The relationship between the U.S. and the Middle East had reached an all-time low, as social distrust was at an all-time high. And so this kind of brings me to the end of the presentation. I'm going to restate my thesis again, because I know that when talking about such kind of muddled issues, it's possible to forget what our end goal and sight was. But my thesis is that the widespread conflicts that exist between the U.S. and some parts of the Middle East have transitioned from being rooted in political necessity to being fueled by ideological differences and social distrust as a result of past political action. So to sum up and to explain how we found this out, I'm so sorry. Okay, so firstly, it can be seen that when the United States began its widespread influence in the Middle East, it was mostly to settle conflicts and disputes between formal Middle Eastern governments, as well as for political necessity. We saw this with the recognition of the State of Israel in 1947. We saw this with the coup d'etat in 1953. We saw this in 1956 with the Suez Canal crisis and the Eisenhower Doctrine being established. It was very, very, it was thought out political action, usually used to stop the spread of communism and nationalism for our own political interests, not really an ideology thing. Secondly, it is clear that as U.S. intervention in the Middle East continued to grow, members of the Arab world had compiled a serious list of complaints that, when left unresolved, became fuel for the terrorist regime. And this can be seen with the multiple terrorist uprisings that occurred between pretty much the beginning of the 80s and before 2001. It proves that there were many tensions in the Middle East against Americans, and it can kind of logically be deduced as from a result of U.S. intervention and the amount of political sway that we had over the region at the time. Not many people were happy with that. So lastly, the terrorist attacks on U.S. soil brought on by U.S. intervention in the Middle East marked an extreme change in U.S. foreign policy. So basically after 9/11, everything changed. We launched into a huge war where it's wounded over 1 million, killed over 6,000, and that's just American casualties. Over 100,000 Iraqi civilians have been killed. It's been brutal. Anyway, as I kind of sum up my presentation, I just want to end by kind of saying that my opinion on these matters has been really shaped by the research that I've done over the past few months. I take somewhat a moderate stance. I don't think that anybody is to blame for the tensions that go, or I don't think any sole party is to blame for the tensions between our two regions. I think that it's more of a cause and effect sort of thing. U.S. intervention brought around terrorism, which brought about more intervention, and I really just think that if I would like you to think about one thing, it would be to examine the root causes of the war for yourself and to kind of decide what you think could have been done differently to prevent the huge amount of bloodshed that occurred as a result of the conflict between these two regions and what's still going on today. Thank you.